Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every day Canadian shippers suffer from consequences of getting reliable rail freight services. Farmers cannot get their grain, soybeans, and canola delivered to the port on time, resulting in missed ships, upset overseas customers, and rotting crops. Lumber and paper companies in more than 500 forestry-dependent communities can't get their products shipped or supplies delivered because of patchy rail freight services, affecting the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of Canadians. Mining operations, the largest employer for Aboriginal people, have to idle production because they cannot get their coal and other minerals picked up on time. The effects are real. Hundreds of millions of dollars in lost productivity, countless lost jobs, and lower competitiveness for Canadian businesses in the global marketplace. Canada's farming, natural resources, and manufacturing companies are innovative and hardworking, but they lose out against global competitors when they cannot connect with their export partners and disrupt supply chains. Why is this? Why are our farmers frustrated about delayed pickups of their crops? Why are mining companies frustrated about promised rail cars that are never delivered, and paper factories frustrated about damaged rail cars that they can't put their products on? Because we have a classic case of market power abuse. The small lentil farmers in Manitoba simply can't get reliable and affordable freight services from a rail company like CN, even though CN made the annual profit last year is $2.7 billion. Those lucky enough to get a contract with CN and CP have to put up with service disruptions, while many smaller companies can't even get a contract in the first place. 8 out of 10 rail customers are unhappy with the freight services they get from the big rail companies. Around 80% of rail commitments between the rail companies and farmers and grain elevators are not fulfilled. The future pictures get even more dramatic. 45% of shippers say that their rail freight services have gotten worse over the past 3 years. So why is the situation so bad? Healthy competition in the marketplace brings prices down and creates a balance between supply and demand. But that's not the case with rail freight services. Rail freight customers are faced with the entrenched dual monopoly. Together, CN and CP dominate with a market share of close to 95%. CN alone account for 57% of the market based on revenues, and CP account for 38%. The remaining 5% are 49 short line operators that haul freight to the 2 main lines. So around 80% of rural shippers are captive, meaning they have no choice but to go with the one big rail company that operates in their area. A textbook case of a monopoly. No choice but to pay higher prices. No choice but to suffer the consequence of unreliable services. No choice but to endure scheduling changes without advance notices. Canadians have no choice but get a black eye on the international stage for unreliable export delivery. It's a marketplace that is broken, where legitimate demand is not countered by adequate supply of services. In the words of the Canadian Industry Transport Association, and I quote, "Rail freight is not a normally functioning competitive market, and this is the fundamental issue underlying all the price and service problems encountered by rail shippers. It's a market dominated by sellers," and that he meant CN and CP. So what about other modes of transportation? Why can't rail freight customers ditch the rail companies and go for delivery by trucks or by ship? To quote the Canadian Industry Transport Association again, quote, "The reality of moving to other modes in most cases is not practical in any reasonable scenario. truck equipment may not be available in the short to medium term, and volumes may be too great to transfer to trucks. So, over the past 7 decades, the railways have lost significant market share to trucking, and it is likely that most traffic that could take advantage of the trucking option has moved to trucks. In other words, trucking only works for certain distances depending on the value and the volume of the freight. Just to illustrate, a train hauling potash carries an average cargo of 10,000 tons. That's the equivalent of 385 semi-trucks. Leaving aside considerations like pricing and delivery time, just getting such a fleet of trucks is simply unrealistic in most cases when a rail company decides not to show up on time. And it's not just the shippers that are captive. Many of the Canada's ports are as well. East of Montreal to the port of Halifax, CN is the only major railway. A similar situation exists in northern BC, with CN being the only railway serving the port of Prince Rupert. Likewise, southeastern BC and southern Alberta are served only by CP. In parts of northern Ontario, the CN and CP main lines are enough separated that they are monopoly rail carriers in those areas as well. Given this situation, any efforts from the industry and the government must focus on improving rail freight services while making the pricing competitive so rail freight customers are not left completely vulnerable. One of the core issues is that shippers have no effective way to get the contracts fulfilled, if they are even among the lucky ones who were able to sign an agreement. In the words of the Western Grain Elevator Association, rail companies continue to deliver unreliable services, and I quote, because they can. There are no effective, legal, or financial consequences. When it comes to consequences for non-performance, we again have a completely lopsided situation. By contrast, shippers have to pay penalty fees to CN and CP if they don't have the promised volumes ready for shipping, or if they fail to load the rail cars on time. But it doesn't work the other way around. Rail cars not showing up on time or goods being delivered late, no problem for CNCP. They get away with all the unreliable behavior or bad behavior without paying a penny, or should I say a nickel today. The shipper has no choice but suffer the economic consequences caused by the rail companies. So we have a pretty desperate picture of Canada's rail customers. And what has this government done to protect them? For years, they kept themselves busy with talking and making promises. In 2007, they promised an independent investigation of the situation. The much-heralded Rail Freight Service Review finally started in 2008. For almost 3 years, its experts gathered information, talked to shippers and rail companies, commissioned a much-revealing survey, and came up with 8 key recommendations. The final report was tabled in early 2011. The Minister of Transport at that time promised legislation. And then what happened? Well, there was an election. After the election, more talking. More than half a year after the final report, the Minister of Agriculture decided it wasn't time for action yet. So he started the Crop Logistic Working Group. Of course, the Minister of Transport didn't want to get outdone, so he kicked off a mediation process between shippers and rail companies in late 2011. But as predicted, the mediation was ultimately fruitless because there's a complete imbalance of power. CN and CP were unwilling to make meaningful concessions during the several rounds of negotiations. Without yielding any concrete results, the chair, Jim Denning, released a report in June of 2012. Now, New Democrats have stood with the shippers along the way. I tabled my own bill the Rail Customer Protection Act using the recommendations of these various reports. I have repeatedly called on the Minister to give rail customers fair, reliable, and affordable services they need to be successful to make Canada's economy stronger. And the shipping community has consistently been asking the federal government to fix the major issues, and they've been talking about this for at least over 10 years. One would assume that after all those deliberations and investigations, the government would present a rock-solid bill that protects rail customers, level the playing field, and bring a balance of power to the shipping customers. Well, unfortunately, while Bill C-52 is a step forward, it falls short of what should be accomplished. How? While shippers will have the right to a service agreement in this bill, there's no model, no guidelines, no template in this bill to back up that right. Shipping customers want a model service agreement, one that gives shippers and rail companies flexibility to negotiate while starting with certain elements already on the table, like performance measurements and consequences for non-performance. They didn't get one in this bill. Instead, the bill said nothing about what should be in the service agreements. Many shippers are already afraid that they have won a hollow victory. Now, they will sit down with a rail company knowing that they have the right to an agreement, but every single component will have to be a concession from CN and CP, which is a very tough place to start from. It comes as a disappointment for many shippers that penalties for non-performances are not included in this bill. Rail customers desperately need to include such penalty fees in service agreements to get compensation for service disruption and the resulting damages and productivity losses. The current bill only includes fines of up to $100,000 in the case of arbitration outcome being ignored by either party. And that arbitration process is only available to shippers that negotiate a service agreement for the first time. The other problem is that such a fine would be paid to the federal government, not to the customer. To act as real deterrent, fines would have to be significantly higher. Just keep in mind, unreliable rail services are costing these customers millions of dollars, while CN made $2.7 billion last year. Another shortcomings of Bill C-52 is that the brand new arbitration process is only available for shippers that are negotiating new contracts. Instead of offering quick and reliable help through conflict resolution to all shippers, Bill C-52 offers arbitration to a small group of shippers. The other problem is that the outline arbitration process could end up being too costly for smaller shippers. And to place the burden of proof on the shippers to demonstrate that they need rail customer services, that they are indeed captives, is indeed unfair and one-sided. Bill C-52 applies only to the new service agreements, not existing ones. That means that many shippers will continue to be stuck with unreliable and unfair and unaffordable services. They will continue to be without any conflict resolution process in the case of violations to existing service agreements. And the bill doesn't even tackle the elephant in the room, pricing. For years, shippers have been complaining about uncompetitive freight rates. It's common that shippers pay prices that are 3 times as high as the rail company's variable cost or direct cost for the services. 3 times. Because the shipping companies can get away with it, because there's no choice for the customers. So the government is wasting the opportunity to get rail customers not only fair and reliable, but also affordable and competitively priced freight services. To give rail customers real protection from unreliable services, protection from price gouging, protection from a monopoly that costs farmers, logging and mining industries millions of dollars. In conclusion, it's clear that federal action is needed to create a more level playing field for Canada's customers, shippers, among them many exporters. They deserve fair, reliable, and affordable rail freight services to compete and strive. Bill C-52 is a step in the right direction, but it is a bill that falls short of the hopes of many shippers. A bill that won't cover all freight customers. So many customers will be left behind. A bill that won't provide a model agreement. So the customers have to start from scratch. A bill that won't compensate them for bad services. So therefore, what is the consequence of unreliable services? Not much. A bill that won't curb the monopoly power of the rail company giants. And a bill that won't end price gouging. In committee, I will work hard to improve the bill in line with the key customers' demands, and I look forward to working with the government and the shipping community to address C-52's shortcomings. I'm optimistic that a stronger and more useful bill is possible, that it is within reach to finally make rail freight services reliable and affordable for Canada businesses. This country was built on railways, and we owe it to the farmers in the prairies, and the paper mill worker in Quebec, and the miners in British Columbia that we make Canada's rail system work again for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.